Good evening. Tonight's story begins in January. Not a modern January, with overpriced snow boots, Instagram snowflakes, and central heating that clicks on before you've even gotten out of bed. No. This is January 1347. In a thatch-roof cottage at the edge of a forgotten village, where the wind bites through the cracks in the timber, and warmth is something you have to make, hour by hour, with your bare hands. The firewood is running low. The snow is already ankle-deep inside the doorway. And your husband, bless him, is trying to repair a hole in the barn roof with a piece of frozen bread. You have 3 children, one of them is coughing, none of them have shoes that fit. And dinner, once again, is a question mark you'll have to answer with creativity, negotiation, and possibly a stolen turnip. Tonight we'll follow this woman, who wasn't extraordinary, but responsible for keeping her family alive, on a freezing January, even when no one noticed she was the reason. This is the story of what it took to survive one medieval month, when everything outside wanted you frozen, starved, or forgotten. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. So let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. That's the story I'm telling tonight. She didn't remember when winter started. Not exactly. It wasn't like today, with dates on a calendar or a forecast that let you know which Tuesday would bring snow. No, winter came like a warning that didn't speak aloud. First it was the wind, curling under the door frame, slipping through the thatch, lifting the hem of your skirt when you bent to stir the pot. Then came the silence, that eerie hush when even the birds had left, and the ground stopped making mud because it had frozen all the way through. And then one morning, the pail outside had a lid of ice so thick, it didn't crack when she hit it with a spoon. The fire had to be lit before anything else. Before teeth were brushed, not that anyone brushed them, before the children opened their eyes, before her husband even sat up with that look he wore in the cold months, dazed, silent, and half useless. He was kind enough, in a distracted sort of way. But winter was a test, and she always knew who would pass it. Not him. The man could sharpen a blade or patch a boot, but he didn't carry the shape of the household in his bones the way she did. He didn't know how many handfuls of grain were left, or which child's cough meant trouble and which didn't. He didn't hear the way the beams creaked at night, not the usual creak, but the kind that made her press a palm to the wall and pray nothing would collapse before morning. The cottage was small, but winter made it smaller. The children huddled near the hearth, wrapped in last year's wool, too short now, but still warm if you tucked your knees in. One of them, little Tom, had taken to sleeping with a rock, warmed in the embers and then tucked into a cloth. It was her idea, of course. He thought it was magic. She let him believe it. There was no school, no shop, no road that could be taken safely in January. The village, whose name barely mattered beyond its borders, was more of a handful of roofs than a place. A cluster of families trying not to starve within earshot of each other. You didn't leave unless you had to. The snow came up to your calves by now, heavy and wet, not the lovely white kind that sparkled in poems, but the kind that soaked through your only shoes and froze your skin on the walk to nowhere. So she stayed. She always stayed. There were animals to tend. 2 hens who hadn't laid in weeks, a goat who was more pet than provider these days, and a cat who never caught anything but seemed to believe herself essential. There was bread to ration. Not bake, that ship had sailed weeks ago. No more flour. Just slices shaved off what was left, dipped in broth and whispered to, "Please be enough this time, just one more bowl." But it was her who made the day start. Who cracked the ice. Who woke the fire. Who stood outside in the frozen dark with the pail balanced on her hip, drawing water that bit her wrists and made her question, for the 1000th time, how anyone ever survived this month. She didn't keep lists, not on paper, at least. But in her mind, there was always an inventory. A running tally she recited while washing her hands with ash, or stirring whatever thin concoction passed for stew that week. She could close her eyes and see it like shelves in her mind. Left, 2 onions, softening fast. A fistful of barley, hidden in a tin under the bed. One half-wheel of cheese, going sharp. 2 turnips that had started to sprout at the ends but were still edible if she cut around the green. A pot of something that might be broth, or might just be hot water that smelled of yesterday's broth. 3 eggs, a miracle, really, from the hens who had, for reasons known only to them, laid in the hay pile and not the usual nesting box. And 1 apple, shriveled and pocked, but whole. She hadn't touched it. Not yet. Not until it was someone's birthday, or someone's fever broke. She had tried once to show her husband the inventory, not with words, but by pointing, lifting lids, opening the cellar door with a kind of theatrical silence. He nodded solemnly, scratched his beard, and said something like, "We'll make it stretch." But he didn't know how. Stretching was her gift. It was an invisible talent, like patching socks until the patches became socks themselves, or folding the same blanket 3 different ways to make it feel new. She could stretch a meal across 4 mouths and still save a ladleful for tomorrow. He could stretch rope, maybe. Not carrots. Fuel was another category, measured not in weight but in hours. 3 logs. Half a stack of kindling. A bag of dried dung, smoky, but better than nothing. She knew how long each would last, depending on the wind, the time of day, and how close the baby clung to her chest. She'd learned how to bake stones near the flames and place them in beds to fake warmth. She'd learned which floorboards creaked the loudest, and how to walk the house like a ghost to avoid waking the children when she needed to think. There was no salt. That had run out after Christmas. No honey, no butter, no cloth to spare. The goat gave barely a trickle now, and even that she rationed carefully, a spoonful for the baby, maybe, if he whimpered long enough. No meat, unless someone died. And even then, she wasn't the kind of person who got first pick. But she had a string. And thread. And time. Not the good kind, where you sit and rest, but the bitter kind, long stretches of cold hours with nothing to do but listen to the house shift and wonder if the bread would mold before it was gone or go stale before it was enough. She had hope, but not the poetic kind. Not the kind that glows. Her hope was more like a dull ember, stubborn, nearly cold, but refusing to go out. It said, "Not today." And that was enough. She dressed in layers, not because they were warm, but because they existed. A shift made from rough flax, patched so many times the original fabric was more memory than cloth. Over that, a woolen gown that had belonged to her mother once, long before the sleeves were shortened and the hem let out and the entire thing reshaped to fit someone who moved differently, not slower, but heavier, with the weight of 3 births and 17 winters behind her. Over that, an apron. Not clean, but always useful. And when she stepped outside, which she only did when absolutely necessary, she tied on a second shawl and wrapped a third around her hands like gloves. Gloves, of course, were for noble women. She had once fashioned a pair from an old sock, fingers cut into the shape of a prayer. They lasted a week. Her boots, if you could call them that, were leather once, but now closer to bark. Stiff from wet and dry, then wet again, then frozen overnight so thoroughly they had to be warmed by the fire before she could even get them on. The soles flapped. She tied them with twine, which snapped every few days, and replaced the stuffing with straw, though the straw always went flat by noon. Walking anywhere felt like stepping on cold sponges wrapped in splinters. The cold didn't just bite. It seeped. Into the seams of things. Into the joints of your fingers, the cracks of your lips, the soft spot behind your knees. It curled into the corners of the cottage like a creature with time on its hands. It wasn't the kind of cold that made you shiver and then pass, it was the kind that set up camp. The kind that stayed. There was ice inside the house. That still surprised her, somehow, that something so cruel could breach the walls they'd built with their own hands. It formed on the edges of the windows, though there was barely any glass left, just waxed cloth nailed into place. Sometimes it glittered along the beams, the tiniest icicles forming where the thatch met the rafters, sharp and smug. The floorboards creaked not from footsteps, but from cold itself, stretching the wood like bones too old for their body. Water had to be brought in before sundown, or it would freeze in the pail. Bread left too close to the wall became stone by morning. She'd once found the baby's blanket rimmed in frost where it had slipped off during the night. She didn't cry then, there was no time, but she had taken the goat's sheepskin lining and wrapped it around the baby, consequences be damned. And still, the cold got in. Into the straw beds, the cracks of the door, the spaces between fingers when she reached for the spoon. Her breath was visible indoors. Her hair, damp from the morning snow, froze into stiff strands by the time she finished the washing. Even the cat, who usually claimed the best seat by the hearth, hissed when its tail touched the stones. And yet, she moved. That was the trick. She never stopped moving for too long. Motion was the closest thing to warmth. She stirred, scrubbed, chopped, carried, swept, bent, stirred again. If you kept moving, you didn't freeze. If you froze, well, no one was coming to save you. Certainly not in January. Children feel the cold differently. That's what older women used to say. They're made of fire, someone once told her when her first was born, pink and screaming and steaming in the bathwater like a loaf just pulled from the oven. And it was true, for a while. The littlest ones ran and shrieked and flopped onto the floor with bare hands, and somehow, despite the ice on the door frame and the frost in their lashes, they still laughed like the world wasn't pressing in. But it faded, that fire. Slowly. And so her job, among a dozen others, was to keep it burning. Not just the fire in the hearth, but the one in their chests. The one that said, "You're safe here. You are fed, you are watched, you are known." She did it without ceremony. She wrapped them in everything. Scarves. Aprons. Cut up bits of old skirts tied around their legs like makeshift gaiters. She filled their sleeves with dried moss, stuffed into the gaps between shirt and skin to make up for the wool they didn't have. She sewed mittens from a sackcloth so coarse it gave them rashes, but they wore them anyway. She rubbed their toes between her palms when they came in from the snow, even though her own fingers were already numb. When they cried from the cold, which they sometimes did, especially the middle one, who never slept past dawn and always lost his scarf, she told them stories. She made up tales about talking animals who liked winter. A fox who collected snowflakes in jars. A goat who built a bakery in a cave. None of it made sense. That wasn't the point. The point was keeping them still, distracted, wrapped in the spell of pretend long enough for their bodies to warm again. She played games, too. Not the loud ones, no one had the energy for that. But soft games. Guessing games. Sorting buttons by warmth. Lining up stones and giving each one a name. Who can find the warmest place in the cottage without moving? Who can hold their breath the longest and pretend they're hibernating? She turned hardship into ritual. Every day when the frost formed on the hearthstones, she had the eldest sweep it into a bucket and call it dragon dust. They drew shapes in it before tossing it out the door. The littlest one believed it protected them. She let that belief stand. At night, they all slept together. One pile of limbs, tangled on the largest straw mattress with every blanket stacked on top like a burial mound. Her husband snored. The baby kicked. Someone always had a cough. But it was warm. Warmer than anywhere else. Sometimes, when the wind howled so loud it rattled the pots, she lay there in the dark and whispered, "What are we today?" And one of the children would answer, "A loaf of bread, or a nest of mice, or once, a secret fire beneath a mountain." And she would smile. Because the cold hadn't taken their imagination. Not yet. And as long as they could pretend, even just a little, they could make it through another night. Children feel the cold differently. That's what the old women used to say. They're made of fire, someone once told her, probably while blowing on their own frozen fingers and trying to believe it. And it was true, for a time. The littlest ones ran barefoot across frozen floors, shrieking like wild foxes, faces red with cold and joy as if winter was some sort of game. Which, to be clear, it wasn't. But try explaining that to a 6-year-old who thinks frostbite is a fun word. She had 3 of them. No mittens. No boots that fit. No concept of danger. Just raw enthusiasm and feet that somehow always found the one hole in the thatch where the snow blew through. Modern children, if they so much as feel a draft while playing video games in fleece pajamas, declare it a polar emergency. These ones? They were happy if they could sit closest to the hearth and warm one toe at a time like roasted marshmallows. Without, of course, knowing what marshmallows were. Or sugar. Or joy, really. But they tried. She wrapped them in layers. Not soft flannel or cute matching sets from the winter latest trends on Instagram. Layers made of whatever hadn't disintegrated yet. Bits of skirts, old sacks, a discarded curtain she'd hemmed into something that resembled pants if you squinted. She tied their sleeves shut with twine. She stuffed straw into their shoes. Not because she read it on a parenting blog, but because there was nothing else between them and the ground. When the middle one got chilblains, she told him it was a dragon's kiss and rubbed his feet with goose fat. He believed her. It helped. When they cried from the cold, which they did, often and loudly and usually in shifts, she told them stories. Not cheerful ones, because she didn't have the strength. But strange ones. A goose that knitted scarves from clouds. A rat who kept a secret stew beneath the floorboards. The rules didn't matter. The stories were scaffolding. If she could distract them for 6 minutes, maybe the soup would finish boiling. If she could distract them for 10, maybe someone would forget they were hungry. She invented games. Nothing fancy. No battery-operated snowmen or glittery crafts with pine cones. Just survival with a narrative twist. Who can stay under the blanket the longest without moving? Let's pretend we're potatoes underground and can't talk until the sun rises. Guess what I'm holding behind my back? Surprise, it's nothing, because we have nothing. They laughed, sometimes. Not always. Sometimes they cried in confusion, or fought over the warmest rock, or asked why the neighbor's house had smoke coming from the chimney and theirs didn't. And she'd sigh and say something wise, like, because they have secrets and we have character. At night, they all slept together, buried under every blanket, shawl, and semi-clean rag in the house. Her husband, eternally useless after dark, snored like a cow giving birth. The baby whimpered in his sleep. Someone always had a cough, one of those long, wheezing ones that sounded like a haunted bellows and made her sit up every time, wondering if it was the beginning of something final. But she stayed calm. That was her job. She didn't panic when the baby's blanket froze at the corner. She didn't scream when the goat knocked over the water bucket for the 3rd time in one day. She didn't sob when the last onion rolled behind the stove and was now unreachable unless someone removed a wall. She just adjusted. Because that's what mothers did. Not modern mothers with Pinterest boards and snow day snacks and mood lighting. But real ones. With frozen shoes and dragon fat ointment and 3 children wrapped like turnips, pressed against her sides like they were trying to crawl back inside. And in the morning, when they woke up and the world was still white and hard and silent, she whispered, "What are we today?" And one of them would mumble, "A rock in a volcano," or "A candle inside a wolf," or "The warmest thing in the world." And she'd smile, cracked lips and all. Because the cold hadn't won yet. Not today. Her husband's name was Walter. Which already tells you something. There are names that strike fear. Names that sound like thunder or fire or destiny. And then there's Walter, a man-shaped presence with a kind heart, a slow blink, and the general energy of someone who always looks like he just woke up, even when he didn't sleep at all. He meant well. That was the first thing anyone ever said about him. Not brave. Not brilliant. Not particularly helpful in a crisis. But well-meaning, the sort of man who stood next to you while you struggled with something heavy, and said "careful," instead of lifting it. He wasn't lazy. That would have been easier. You can plan around being lazy. But Walter was enthusiastic, in the worst way. He had big ideas. He once spent 2 hours trying to build a snow trap for birds using only breadcrumbs and optimism. He proudly announced he was inventing a sled, using an old door and 3 spoons. When she asked how exactly that would help anyone, he shrugged and said, "Morale?" He didn't grasp the math of winter, not like she did. Not the quiet arithmetic of wood and hours and mouths and silence. He didn't know how long it took the fire to boil water, or which child's cough meant trouble. He couldn't tell the difference between "we're fine for now" and "we're going to starve in 6 days if something doesn't change." But he tried. He was tall, excellent for reaching the bundle of onions she kept hidden on the top shelf where the mice couldn't smell them. He had good hands, useful for chopping logs, when there were logs to chop. And he was, at the very least, uncomplaining. Mostly because he didn't seem to notice when things got bad until they were really bad. He was the sort of man who would look at an empty table and say, "Should I go see if someone has food to trade?" And then come home with a wooden spoon and a story about a goose that stole his hat. Still, he stayed. And that counted. Other men didn't. Some went off to find work and never came back. Some froze. Some drank themselves into forgetfulness and waited for spring. Walter didn't. He stayed. He held the baby, even when the baby was loud. He sang to the children, badly, but with spirit. He told bedtime stories so nonsensical they made the children laugh until they forgot how cold they were. And when the roof leaked, he was the one who climbed up there with a face like a knight about to face a dragon, armed only with twine, a flat rock, and a nail he'd found in the yard. It didn't fix anything. But he meant well. At night, he curled around her like a stove that forgot to light properly. He was warm in patches. He snored. He talked in his sleep. Once, she woke to him mumbling, "Tell the cabbage I'm sorry." She never asked for context. Some things are better left in dreams. Could he do more? Of course. He could learn how long bread lasts without asking her 5 times a day. He could listen, really listen, when she said they were low on grain. He could, just once, take the baby for an hour so she could sit without anyone touching her. But he stayed. And he tried. And in a world where winter wanted you gone, and silence could stretch for days without a single act of kindness, that was enough. Or close enough. It started with heat. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the kind of paranoia that comes from too many cold nights and not enough sleep. But when she pressed her hand to the baby's forehead, her heart dropped before she even moved her palm. He was too hot. Not warm from the fire hot. Not cuddled in blankets hot. The kind of heat that shouldn't live inside something so small. There was no medicine. Not in the way modern mothers might mean it. No syrup. No thermometer. No little dropper with pink sugar and chemical comfort. What she had was willow bark, chewed until bitter, steeped in a cracked pot with snowmelt. What she had was instinct, sharpened by fear. What she had was the weight of every woman who had rocked a fevered child and whispered bargains to the dark. Take anything else, just not this. She wrapped him tight, layers of wool and linen, pressed against her own chest, letting her body be the furnace he couldn't make for himself. She hummed, quietly, not a lullaby, just sound. Sound kept the dread away, and it meant she was still trying. Still here. The other children watched. Silent. They knew. Even the littlest one, who couldn't say fever yet, understood what it meant when their mother didn't get up for the fire, didn't answer when asked what was for breakfast, didn't move from her post on the floor with the baby pressed to her ribs like he might vanish if she let go. And then Walter, her husband, said he'd go out to look for more firewood. It wasn't a bad idea. Fire was everything when death sat so close. But she watched him fumble with his boots, take far too long to wrap his scarf, adjust his hat 3 times before opening the door, and she understood. He didn't know what else to do. He couldn't sit in that room with the heat of the child and the cold of what might come next. So he chose motion. The illusion of usefulness. He came back empty-handed. No explanation. Just a shrug and a mumbled "not much out there." As if the forest had closed for the season. as if trees had politely declined to be helpful. She didn't respond. Didn't accuse. Didn't ask what he'd done with the last 2 hours. She didn't have the energy for disappointment. Her whole body was focused on the tiny weight in her arms, on the flicker of breath, the shifting fever, the way the baby's fingers still curled around hers like roots holding onto soil. And beside her, invisible but constant, was the fear. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just there, curled up like a cat, pressing against her ribs with every breath. The old fear. The one that all women had always known. That even when you did everything right, you could still lose everything. The knock was so soft she thought she imagined it. No one knocked in January. If someone needed something, they shouted from the path, if they came at all. But this was a different sound. Not urgent. Not afraid. Just polite. Like someone who knew the weight of grief and had no wish to add to it. She opened the door and found Agnes standing there, hunched, breathless, arms wrapped around a bundle that smelled faintly of smoke and fish. Agnes, the widow from 2 doors down. Her face had the wind-burned look of someone who walked slowly and let the weather decide her pace. Her boots were soaked through. Her eyes were tired. But she smiled, just barely, and said, "Thought you might be low." Inside the bundle was a scrap of dried fish, wrapped in old cloth. And, impossibly, a stub of a candle, short and dented, with a bit of wick still clinging to life. It wasn't a gift, exactly. Not in the way modern minds might imagine, wrapped with twine and a ribbon and a note that says you've got this. It was older than that. More sacred. One woman recognizing another at the brink, and offering what little could be spared. They Saturday. Not on chairs, there weren't enough for both, but on opposite sides of the hearth, one with her back against the stones, the other on a folded blanket, knees drawn up. The baby was sleeping, for now. The other children sat still for once, quiet in that eerie, reverent way they sometimes had when grown women talked like the world was ending softly. Agnes didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She had seen a fever before. She had buried 2 sons and a husband. She had done winters without dried fish, without neighbors, without even a candle stub. She simply looked into the fire and said, "Last January, it took the boy with the crooked foot. You remember him?" She did. They spoke in low tones, passing names like embers, people lost last year, the year before, during the blizzard of 42, during the famine, the cough that spread through the village 2 winters back. Each name left a mark in the air and then dissolved, smoke curling into silence. They didn't cry. Crying was for other seasons. In January, you saved every drop of water. Instead, they sat in the kind of stillness that only women know, the stillness of 2 people who have endured more than they could ever say aloud, and who do not need to speak to be understood. When Agnes stood to go, she touched the baby's head, so gently, and said, "His hot, but not fading. You'll know the difference when you see it." And then she left, boots squelching, shawl pulled tight, vanishing back into the white. The baby whimpered. The wind picked up. And the candle flickered once, then held. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, first as a low groan through the trees, then a rattle in the eaves, and finally a full-throated howl that made the walls shake like a drunk man leaning on them. The wind wasn't just outside, it was in the house. Sliding through every crack, lifting corners of blankets, pressing cold fingers against the back of her neck like it had a personal vendetta. Snow came sideways. It forced its way through the shutter gaps and collected in little piles on the floor, soft at first, then sharp, like someone had spilled powdered glass across the hearthstones. The fire, which had been obedient all morning, began to sulk. No matter how much she fed it, the flames bent backward, hissed, and shrank, as if the wind had insulted it personally and it was sulking in response. Then the drip started. Not a new sound. Not surprising. But unwelcome all the same. She looked up and saw it, a slow, deliberate leak from the thatch, right above the shelf where she kept the grain tin. A dark spot growing with each breath. Walter, naturally, was managing the fire. That was what he called it. In practice, this meant crouching in front of the hearth with a look of deep concentration and occasionally muttering, "Come on now, don't be shy." As if the flames were being stubborn on purpose. She didn't say anything. She just grabbed the ladder, which was actually a chair stacked on top of a barrel, tied a scarf around her face, and climbed up onto the roof. Mid-blizzard. The thatch was soaked. The wind nearly knocked her flat. Her hands went numb in seconds. She used twine, an old cloth sack, and a prayer muttered through clenched teeth to wedge a patch into the leak. Her skirts whipped around her legs like angry dogs. Snow got in her sleeves. The wind laughed in her ears. She pressed her body flat to the slope and thought, this is how people die, fixing things that should have stayed broken. Inside, Walter had added, "Come on, little fellow," to his fire negotiations. By the time she got down, the back of her dress was soaked, her nose was red, and her fingers looked like something from a cautionary tale. But the leak had slowed. The bread dough she'd set to rise that morning hadn't moved. It sat in the bowl like a lump of regret. Too cold, too flat, too tired to care. She looked at it. It looked back. Neither of them had the strength to pretend. The children were curled by the hearth, eyes wide, blankets wrapped like cocoons. One of them whispered, "Are we gonna be blown away?" And she answered, "Only if the wind finds the door." Walter, in the corner, was poking the fire with the wrong end of the poker. And somehow the cottage held. He was only 8, but already he moved like someone who had known too many winters. He watched the pot the way grown men watch the sky for signs. And lately, when she handed him the wooden spoon, he didn't ask questions, he just stirred. His hands were still small, but they were learning the rhythm. 2 slow circles, pause. Scrape the edge. Lift, test the weight. He was starting to understand how to keep things from burning, how to stretch flavor from scraps, how to let hunger teach you patience without letting it make you mean. Each child had their role. Not assigned, just understood. The middle one counted everything. Beans, buttons, cracks in the wall. She turned his counting into a game, naming each tally like a soldier in an invisible army. The littlest followed her from room to room like a shadow in wool, mimicking her gestures, handing her cloths that weren't clean but felt like help anyway. They didn't know they were learning. But they were. Every day spent inside that cottage, every moment by the hearth, every question they asked and every answer she gave was a kind of armor. Not for now, but for the winters ahead. She folded small rituals into their days. Simple things. Quiet things. They sang when they stirred the pot, not because they liked the sound of their own voices but because it made the room feel less empty. They rubbed their hands together 3 times before stepping outside, like it was a spell. They whispered wishes into the steam rising off the broth, and each night before sleep, they played the same game, find the warmest thing. One child might say it was the inside of their boot. Another might say the spot on the floor where the cat had been. Once, it was the steam that rose when someone sneezed. The answers didn't matter. What mattered was that they kept looking. She taught them how to mend seams with twine when thread ran out. How to dry orange peels for the smell alone. How to press their backs to the stones of the hearth when the fire was low, and how to keep the baby calm by rocking their own legs like they were cradling him too. None of it was written down. None of it would be remembered in stories. But she watched their fingers move a little more surely each day, and she knew they would not break easily. Walter had his own contributions. One night, he insisted on telling a story, eager to entertain the children in what he described as a rare moment of peace. She raised an eyebrow but let him have his moment. He began with a prince, or possibly a baker, who was cursed to turn into a loaf of bread unless he could find a magic ladle hidden inside a goat. The plot twisted and meandered. There was a turnip involved. Possibly also a shipwreck. One child tried to follow. Another fell asleep with their eyes still open. By the time the story ended, abruptly, with the words "and that's why soup is lucky," the room had gone quiet, and so had he. She didn't tease him for it. Just tucked the blanket higher over the children and stirred the fire until it agreed to stay lit a little longer. And that night, when the wind scraped against the windows and the snow whined beneath the doorframe, the house stayed still. Because they knew how to make it so. It was nearly midnight when she heard the noise. Not a scream. Not even a cry. Just a soft, broken sound like something exhaling too slowly. At first, she thought it was the wind again, or one of the children having a dream. But when she opened the door to check the lean-to where the goat slept, the cold hit her like a slap. She didn't need a lantern. The snow reflected what little moonlight there was. Enough to see the shape of the goat slumped against the far corner, her legs tucked beneath her, motionless. The breath caught in her throat before she even reached her. She didn't call out, not because she was calm, but because her voice had simply forgotten how. The goat had been with them for 5 years. Longer than the youngest child. More loyal than most humans she knew. And now she was so still, so folded in on herself, that for a moment it looked like the snow had already claimed her. She knelt. Pressed her hands against the coarse flank. Cold. Too cold. She didn't speak. She didn't think. She just moved, untying her shawl, wrapping it around the goat's belly, slipping her arms beneath the fragile body and rocking back and forth like she was holding a fevered child. Her breath came in clouds, curling around her face and disappearing into the dark. Her knees were already wet. Her fingers stung. But she didn't stop. Inside, the fire snapped once, muffled by the wind. Walter came to the doorway, eventually. He stood for a moment, silhouetted in the light from the hearth, his expression unreadable. Then he said the one thing he should not have said. Maybe, it's time to let it go. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. He retreated inside, possibly to tend the fire, possibly to avoid the weight of her silence. Either way, he disappeared. She stayed. Rocked. Hummed something tuneless under her breath, not to calm the goat, but to remind her own body to keep going. Minutes passed. Or hours. The line blurred. Then, a twitch. The goat's ear flinched. Barely a movement, but she felt it. A spark of heat beneath the frost. She shifted the shawl, pressed her cheek against the fur, whispered something she didn't remember afterward. And slowly, almost grudgingly, the goat exhaled. The next morning, the goat stood. Shakily. As if she'd simply overslept. The children cheered. Walter declared it a miracle. And she, still shivering, still damp, still carrying the quiet ache in her shoulders, simply nodded and poured water into the trough as if nothing had happened at all. It didn't arrive with trumpets. There was no great thaw, no dramatic melting of snow in broad daylight. Spring came like everything else in her life, quietly, almost guiltily, as if it wasn't sure it had the right to show up. She noticed it in the drip. One slow, steady sound. A trickle running down the edge of the thatch and falling in irregular taps into a puddle that hadn't been there yesterday. The snow hadn't disappeared, it was still everywhere, but now it slouched. Its edges softened. It looked less like a wall and more like something that might eventually move. The air changed, too. Not warm, not even close. But less sharp. Less punishing. Her fingers didn't sting the second she stepped outside. The goat had started eating more. The children's cheeks held color past noon. Inside the cottage, there was no celebration. No clapping. No speeches. Just small things, like Walter whistling while fetching water, badly but with enthusiasm. The middle child sorting pebbles again, instead of just staring into the fire. The dough, for the first time in weeks, had begun to rise. She didn't smile, exactly. But her shoulders dropped half an inch. She stood straighter. The constant tension behind her ribs, the one she'd been holding since the first frost, loosened just enough for her to take a full breath. She looked around the room and saw what was left. A goat, alive. 3 children, fed. A man, still useless, but present. A fire that no longer needed coaxing. No one would remember what she did that winter. There would be no story, no name etched into wood, no song about the woman who patched the roof in a blizzard or boiled the same root 5 different ways to keep her family alive. But she would remember. And so would the hands of the children she'd kept warm. So would the goat that stood now because she didn't give up. So would the floor, the walls, the fire, all of them bearing the quiet marks of a woman who endured when there was no one watching. Because not every kind of strength shouts. Some of it just survives. So if you're still here, still listening, still curled beneath the blankets while the world quiets around you, thank you for staying here. Even if you're still awake, listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. Let yourself rest now. Good night. Script written by Clara Finch, because good stories deserve a soul.